Some Christians think you're going to hell for using the wrong calendar. Some Christians are so Catholic they think Mary is really present in communion. If you study denominations for a living like I do, you'll find a lot that are heretical, but some that are not exactly heretical, they're just weird. First up is Western Orthodoxy. You heard me, Western Orthodoxy. Not Catholicism, not Eastern Orthodoxy, Western Orthodoxy. It includes the Celtic Orthodox Church and the French Orthodox Church and a few others. Now, this is also not to be confused with Western Rite Orthodoxy, which is basically Eastern Orthodoxy, but with Western, usually Anglican liturgical traditions. Usually these are Anglican churches that have left Anglicanism and come into communion with mainstream Eastern Orthodoxy. But Western Orthodoxy is not in communion with mainstream Eastern Orthodoxy, even though it has the same theology and many of the same traditions. This is its own thing. It is very small, but it still exists. It started when some Catholic priests in France and Ireland left Catholicism and joined Eastern Orthodoxy, but for various reasons are no longer in communion with the rest of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, the true Orthodox definitely are Eastern. In fact, they were too Eastern for Eastern Orthodoxy. This is basically a much more conservative version of Eastern Orthodoxy. Sometimes they're called the Old Calendarists, because as some of you might know, Eastern Orthodoxy traditionally uses a different calendar than Western Christianity. But in recent years, some Orthodox churches have allowed themselves to shift towards the same calendar that Catholics and Protestants use, for the sake of ecumenical unity. But there are a lot of Eastern Orthodox Christians who don't like ecumenism with Catholics and Protestants. In Eastern Orthodoxy, liturgy, which includes the calendar, is the essence of the faith. So if you change the calendar, you're changing the liturgy, and if you change the liturgy, you're changing the faith. So they basically anathematized not only all the Orthodox churches who use the new calendar, but all Orthodox churches in communion with Orthodox churches who use the new calendar. So they consider themselves the one true church, and everyone else, including the world Orthodox, is heretical. Unlike some of these groups, they actually have a substantial population, especially in certain countries. They have a much more conservative interpretation and application of the ecumenical councils and their canons than the World Orthodox. And they separated with World Orthodoxy in the 20th century. But there's another Orthodox group that separated with World Orthodoxy much earlier. The Old Believers are too truly Orthodox for the true Orthodox. The Russian Old Believers are basically the Amish of Eastern Orthodoxy. They separated from mainstream Eastern Orthodoxy over many things, including whether to cross yourself with 2 or 3 fingers. Basically, in the 1600s, the Russian Orthodox Church made a lot of liturgical reforms that the Old Believers didn't like. So the Old Believers believe they are preserving the true faith and liturgy that most of Eastern Orthodoxy has abandoned. Remember, if liturgy is everything, like it is in Orthodoxy, then liturgical changes are changes to the faith, which is not acceptable. The Old Believers live in very traditional farming communities, and there are lots of them scattered in the rural areas of traditionally Orthodox countries, and some in traditionally Orthodox colonies like Alaska, Washington, and Oregon. Next up, we have British Orthodoxy. Now, all the groups we covered so far are related to Eastern Orthodoxy somehow, but British Orthodoxy is actually related to Oriental Orthodoxy, which has been separate from Eastern Orthodoxy since the year 451 over whether Jesus has 1 or 2 natures. So the British Orthodox Church is Oriental Orthodox in theology and liturgy. They believe that Jesus has only 1 nature that is a union of 2 natures. Why are they not in communion with mainstream Oriental Orthodoxy? Because they're a continuation of this British movement that believes ancient Celtic Christianity was actually Oriental Orthodox. Next, we have Old Catholics. I'm Catholic and I'm old. No. The Old Catholics separated from mainstream Catholicism at the First Vatican Council, when the Roman Catholic Church declared that the Pope is infallible under certain conditions. Other Catholics thought that this contradicted previous Catholic teachings like the Council of Constance, so they became the Old Catholics because they believe they are preserving the Old Catholic faith. These days, Old Catholics are basically a hybrid between Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism, and are often in communion with various Anglo-Catholic groups. Fun fact, Calvin Robinson was briefly part of the Old Catholics when he was on his denominational speedrun. Next up we have Sedevacantists, which means literally, the See of Peter is vacant. They believe that we haven't had a real pope since Vatican II. If the old Catholics split off after Vatican I, the Sedevacantists split off after Vatican II because they believed Vatican II contradicted previous Catholic teachings, because Vatican II teaches that we worship the same God as Muslims, that Muslims can be saved, and that Protestants are departed brethren. So Sedevacantists believe they are the true Catholic Church, and that the Vatican II Catholic Church, meaning the mainstream one, is apostate, and the chair of Peter, meaning the papacy, has been vacant ever since then. Sedevacantist media, like Peter Diamond, will often try and talk about evidences of liberalism in the modern Catholic Church to prove that they are the real Catholics. Some Sedevacantists set up their own parallel papacies, like the Palomarian Church in Spain. They teach that not only is Jesus physically present in communion, but so is Mary. Now let's talk about some Protestants finally. The Netherlands Reformed Church is a tiny hyper-Calvinist schismatic group. They are very conservative, all the women wear head coverings, they're known for being very legalistic, and for causing people to struggle with assurance of salvation. They teach that the covenant of grace, which includes the gospel and the sacraments, is only for the elect. So they often have large churches, but very few people actually receive communion because they believe you shouldn't receive communion unless you're certain that you're one of the elect. And the gospel is not really for you if you're not elect, so the gospel doesn't really give anyone assurance of salvation unless they are perfectly convinced that they are elect anyway. This group split from the mainstream Dutch Reformed churches because they didn't like how the Dutch Reformed would offer the gospel to everyone, like every Christian ever has. Another hyper-Calvinist group is the Primitive Baptists, even though you can't really call them Calvinist at all because they're Baptists and they don't have a Calvinist view of the sacraments, yada yada. But generally, hyper-Calvinism means taking Calvinism to conclusions that Calvin and the Reformed confessions would forbid. Primitive Baptists basically believe that because the elect are going to be saved no matter what, because they're predestined to be saved, you don't even need to preach the gospel to them. So Primitive Baptists think the gospel is irrelevant to salvation. Of course, once the elect realize that they are elect, they should join a church and get baptized, but even if the elect never hear the gospel, they're going to be saved anyway. For this reason, some Primitive Baptists ended up becoming Universalist, believing everyone is going to be saved. Primitive Baptists split from the other Baptists during the Second Great Awakening when everyone wanted to share the gospel and evangelize, and Primitive Baptists didn't want to do that. The Waldensians were basically Protestant before it was cool. Back in the 1200s, this guy Peter Waldo lived a life of poverty on purpose. He criticized the corruption and wealth of the papacy, he denied purgatory, he denied transubstantiation and believed in spiritual presence instead, and he translated the Bible into the language of the people. Because of this, he was excommunicated, but his followers still lived on as the Waldensians. When the Calvinist Reformation happened in the 1500s, most of the Waldensians just joined the Reformed churches because their theology was basically the same, but there are still some Waldensians today left over in places like Italy. Finally, we have the Ancient Church of the East. Now, the thing they split from is already kind of weird. It's the Assyrian Church of the East, which is the historic Nestorian Church that goes all the way back to Nestorius, who was excommunicated for refusing to say that Mary is the Mother of God. The Assyrian Church of the East has been the historic form of Christianity in Persia ever since ancient times, and they even converted China to Christianity in the 600s. Now, pretty recently, the Ancient Church of the East split from the Assyrian Church of the East for the same reason that the True Orthodox split from the Eastern Orthodox. This is literally Nestorian True Orthodoxy. And then, a priest that you might have heard of split from this. Mari Emanuel split from the Ancient Church of the East to become his own non-denominational pastor. It's funny that a lot of young men have converted to Eastern Orthodoxy because of Mari Emanuel, when he is in fact a non-denominational Nestorian. So most of these groups are small and the product of some obscure schism. So what this tells us is that schism is always a temptation that we should avoid, no matter what our denomination is. Instead, we should follow Jesus' prayer that all Christians would be one. Thank you for watching this video. If you want access to some exclusive content or just to support my channel, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get access to all the old live streams as well as some private videos, and depending on what tier you subscribe to, you can request whatever video you want. Also in the description will be the Redeemed Zoomer Discord server, where all denominations are welcome to fellowship and share ideas. However, it's important that if you join, you don't let this replace real-life Christian fellowship, which is why also in the description is a map of traditional Protestant churches for you to attend.